All right, evaluation research. Now, you guys might get a job one day doing this. You might, after you have a lot of experience doing research, do this as a consultant. This might be part of a dissertation that you do, right? Evaluation research is undertaken for the purpose of determining the impact of some intervention, okay? So, some kind of problem. This could be, well, generally this is going to happen when there's federal funding for something. So a prison system gets a grant for some kind of program, which is pretty common. Often there's going to be an assessment piece. The government wants to know what they've invested in and whether or not it's effective. Now, I mean, ideally with any sort of intervention, we should probably be doing this. So, for example, some evaluation research, changes in marijuana laws. Researchers have tried to learn the consequences, both for use and for other forms of social behavior. When we got rid of when we implemented no-fault divorce, does that increase the number of divorces? Does it impact social problems, right? So there is, I read somewhere, but I didn't read a research study, so take this with a grain of salt, that when women were finally able to get divorces and you didn't have to show fault or cause, right, we saw more divorces happen. We saw later age of marriage, and we saw a decrease in some of the accompanying problems because women didn't get stuck staying in abusive relationships. Does no fault automobile insurance bring down insurance rates, etc.? Right? So for those of you guys that are, psychologists and human service folks, you guys are going to probably be in careers where you're doing not a lot of evaluation research, but a lot of interventions, and evaluation research could let you know if they're working. So let's look at some topics here and some research that's been done. Ideally, the best topics for this are things that have practical significance. So the National Highway Transportation and Security Administration did a study in 1981. So you can generally get a discount on your insurance if your kid takes driver's ed courses, right? There's also, I know Massachusetts has this because both of my nieces got this as they just became licensed drivers, that you can get, if you're a good student, I think it's based on your GPA, or it might be if you're based on if you're on the honor roll, you can get a discount on your driver's insurance. So they looked at 17,500 young people in DeKalb County, Georgia, and they looked at students who took driver's ed and students who didn't. And they found that actually students who took driver's ed had just as many accidents and traffic violations as those who didn't. Why might this be happening? Okay. So whenever we look at something, it doesn't mean that giving this discount's a bad idea. It just means that we have to think about what could be playing a role here. So self-selection might be playing a role. The kind of students who take driver's ed are probably already less likely to have accidents and traffic violations, whether they have that training or not, right? The fact that they are seeking out that training or getting that training means they're probably cautious kids already. Students with high grades were more likely to sign up for driver's training, and they were less likely to have accidents, right? So that's probably the origins of that discount. Driver's training may actually have increased traffic accidents. Maybe the availability of driver's eds may encourage some students to get their license sooner than if they didn't have such a course. So in Massachusetts, right, you can get your license at 16 and a half if you've done driver's ed. If you haven't done driver's ed, you have to wait till you're 17. I'm not sure those 6 months make a big difference, but I mean, another thing to really think about here is that young people are inexperienced drivers, right? And so young people are going to have higher rates of accidents. So some of the things we can look at with evaluation research is we could do a needs assessment. We could try to determine the existence and extent of problems among some segment of the population. We can do a cost-benefit study. How much is an intervention costing us compared with what the results are, compared with, with what the results are. And we can also do monitoring studies, right? This provides a steady flow of information about something like crime or the outbreak of an epidemic, right? There was a lot of monitoring research that was published during COVID. You guys might remember every day they were telling us how many people tested positive for COVID, how many people were in the hospital, etc. Now, there's some issues that come up here. Generally, the people being evaluated are not psyched to be evaluated, right? They're not thrilled about the process. It can feel very judgmental. It can feel like, are you doing your job right? So first of all, we have to start with like, what's the intended result of the new program? A friend of mine is kind of struggling with this right now, where she is working with a group of people who are trying to evaluate programs that got funding under the Violence Against Women's Act. And somebody said they should measure repeat victimization. And she pointed out that repeat victimization is common, and that's not the purpose of the VAWA funding, and therefore should we be measuring that? Sometimes we're going to get a vague response, right? Students will get an in-depth and genuine understanding of mathematics. Okay, what does that mean, right? We have to think about what that means. How do we measure in-depth and genuine understanding? We have to be able to operationalize those variables, observe them, measure them. So we need to make sure first that we know what our outcome is, right? What's the outcome we're looking for here? Are we looking for students' grades to increase? Are we looking for crime to decrease? Are we looking for specific crimes to decrease? Now, this may already be part of like the law or the policy or the grant funding. You may be told exactly what you're looking for. Okay. So a 2009 study evaluated the role of positive and negative social capital in determining the success or failure of drug treatment programs in Hong Kong. And the domestic variable, the dependent variable here was how many weeks someone was drug-free. Okay, so like that's pretty straightforward to measure. Now, imagine instead you're looking at a program that's training unskilled people for employment. What would success be? Is success gaining employment after the program? But we also want to look at employment and unemployment rates for society at large, right? We need to look at a control group. So maybe people are not gaining employment, but maybe it's not a good market for jobs right now. You also need to be specific so we can measure our intervention. We might need to include not just like, did someone participate in the intervention, but maybe we have to look at the quality of their participation. That could be number of days attended, number of opportunities accessed, right? So the more you participate in the program, right, like are you just showing up, are you doing the bare minimum, or are you really participating? And how might that impact whether or not you find a job or whatever your outcome is? We also have to think about what population our program is appropriate for. So if we're evaluating a new form of therapy, we should probably be looking at people with mental health issues, right? How do we define and measure mental health issues? We should also measure demographics too. Now, do we want to create new measures for our variables, or do we want to use existing ones? Creating good measures takes time and energy, and those can generally be saved if there's an existing technique, especially if that technique has been validated already. So measures with a long history of use are usually considered reliable and valid. Now, one of the hard parts of evaluation research is determining whether the program succeeded or failed, right? You have to think about how you're going to define success or failure. Does the cost of the program matter? So generally, success and failure, that's going to be a matter of agreement amongst your, like the funder or the people evaluating the program. We can evaluate a program in different ways. So we can use experimental designs, right? And we talked about these in Chapter 8. We can look at classic experiments. We can do a case study. We can do pre-test, post-test, etc. We can use a quasi-experimental design, also covered in Chapter 8, right? We can look at a time series design. We can make some kind of measurement over time. We can compare a control group that's similar to the experimental group, but isn't actually randomly assigned. We can use more than one set of data collected over time so we can make comparisons. Like maybe in terms of measure X, we see improvement, and in terms of measure Y, we don't. We can do qualitative evaluations, right? We can look at, Bart and O'Brien looked at a study of ways to stop rape. They did in-depth interviews with women who had survived a sexual assault and women who had successfully fended off attempts. And they found that resistance, yelling, kicking, running away, was more likely to be successful than to make the situation worse, as we are sometimes told in self-defense classes and as women often fear it will. Steele did a study of programs aimed at pregnant drug users. One program involved counseling. Public health nurses warned pregnant women that that were drug users, if you continue to use drugs, you'll probably have an underweight baby. Okay. They forgot to tell the women, though, that an underweight baby was bad. And a lot of them thought, like, oh, cool, smaller baby, easier delivery, right? So sometimes when we're evaluating a program, part of what we have to look at is, was the program even implemented correctly? Like, so maybe this program would be successful, but we forgot to tell women that a tiny baby isn't necessarily better. Now, lots of logistical problems here. First of all, how do we get people to do what they're supposed to do? How do we get those measurements like distributed? You know, things like that. So imagine we're looking at the effects of a conjugal visit program on the morale of married prisoners. And on the 4th day of the program, an inmate dresses up in his wife's clothes and uses it to escape. Maybe at this point, the superintendent of the facility is like, that's it, no more conjugal visits. Maybe they'll review files and they'll be like, some of these people are bad risks and we can't allow it for them. Maybe there'll be stricter security measures. If we make a change to the program in the middle of evaluating it, the stimulus in the intervention has changed. And we have to either account for that in our analysis, not compare pre and post stimulus change, right? We have to account for that somehow. Now, it might make sense that we would look at evaluation research and we would use it to tinker our laws or our programs or our interventions. Not so, okay? So, by the way, so many examples of this in criminal justice. We have a lot of programs that the research tells us do not work, and we do it anyway. Sex offender registration and notification does not decrease offending. We still do it. The DARE program increases drug use amongst participants. We still do it. Scared Straight doesn't work. We still do it, okay? So here's an example. Nixon puts together this committee. He wants them to study the consequences of pornography. He thinks they're going to come forward and be like, pornography's bad, and that they'll be able to use that information. Now the commission studies it, and they're like, pornography actually doesn't really have too much of a downside to it, right? Doesn't increase the likelihood of sex crimes, for example. You might expect as a result of that we would scale back restrictions on pornography. But instead, the president was just like, yo, all those researchers are wrong. Now, in the 1990s, we passed these 3 strikes laws, and California and Washington are the first 2 states to do it. And Washington state has a relatively reasonable law, and California has a very strict law. And supporters began to very quickly say, oh, the decrease in the crime rate is due to this 3 strikes law. But in California, that decrease was already happening, okay? Research also told us that every $1 million spent on 3 strikes would prevent like 50 crimes, 60 crimes. But every $1 million spent on programs encouraging students to stay in school prevents 258 crimes. So that money should be better spent somewhere else. Now, by the way, they're not saying if you've murdered 3 times, we should lock you up for the rest of your life. But with the 3 strikes law, a lot of times the 3rd strike was any felony. And the 3rd strikes were silly things that you would not want to lock someone up for 25 to life for. One example, a man went into like a grocery store, he stole some steaks, he stuffed them down his pants. As he ran out the store, he bumped into and shoved a clerk. Okay, that's an assault, or actually it's a battery. It's assault and battery. He was charged with a felony, he got 25 to life. I'm not sure that's a good punishment for stealing steak. A lot of legislation went into effect to make some changes in how we approached rape laws. So one was taking rape and instead turning it into, we still have rape as a crime, but having a series of offenses that are more graduated or more graded. We used to require that the victim had physically resisted, and that's no longer required. We used to require corroboration for the victim's testimony. And then we also introduced, stopped introducing evidence of victims' prior sexual conduct. Now, they thought this would encourage women to report, which would increase convictions. And it didn't do that. It did increase the maximum sentence on average, but basically no changes in terms of who's getting convictions, okay? Now, that's probably because other things are playing a role in those convictions, right? And here's an example, right? So you can see the conviction rates stay the same, right? But the median prison sentence goes up. Now, there's lots of reasons that stuff that comes out of research doesn't get implemented. First of all, sometimes it's not understandable to the non-researcher. Remember, we looked at both the YRBS report, and then we also looked at 2 news stories. And those news stories really drive home like a couple of important points from that research. And they do it in a way that's easy for us to understand. Sometimes results contradict our beliefs, right? So like people don't want to believe that sex offender registration and notification doesn't work. People like the idea of it, so we'll just choose to say like, oh, okay. Researchers might have vested interest in the results. A bigger issue here is that most of this research is behind a paywall. As you guys know, you have to go into the databases to get access to them, and the college pays for the databases. So a lot of this research isn't even accessible to people. Now, we might also look at social indicators in our research. These are things that are telling us a little bit about the quality or nature of social life. This is things like mortality rates, infant mortality rates, number of doctors per capita, hospital beds per capita, right? And that lets us compare relative health conditions in different societies. So another piece of evaluation research, there's quite a bit that has to do with the death penalty. Does the death penalty deter crimes as murder? Quick answer, no. So if capital punishment deters people from committing murder, then we should expect to find murder rates lower in states that have the death penalty. States that have the death penalty tend to have the highest murder rates. Okay. There's also ways you can compare this. You can look at states pre and post enacting or repealing the death penalty. You can compare non-death penalty states to death penalty states, right? Lots of different ways to look at this. Like with any of our other research, though, there are ethical considerations. Sometimes the social interventions raise ethical issues. It might, because there's sometimes funding wrapped up in this, there might be pressure to produce certain results. And fraudulent research results in an evaluation study can have more severe consequences.